Hi everyone, welcome back to Map My Reads. Today I wanted to make a video of all the books that I read this winter. It's officially spring now. The buds are coming out and I'm getting excited for the warm weather to come here in Vermont. But I wanted to wrap up the winter season by talking about all the books that I read this season. As you can see by my little book counter here, I read 15 books this winter, which I am pretty happy about. And I made some progress with some other books that I've been reading as well, which I'll talk about. And in my last video that I made a list of all of the books that I wanted to read this winter. And I'm happy to say that I read all of them except for one. And the one that I didn't read is Classic Krakauer, which is a essay collection of essays by Jon Krakauer, who's one of my favorite authors and writers. And I just got distracted by other books that I really wanted to read. And so I didn't get around to that one, but I do plan to read it at some point this year still. And the other book that I wanted to read that I haven't finished yet, but I am reading, is War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. That book is 1,200 pages long, so I don't feel too bad that I haven't finished it. And not to make an excuse, but I am reading it with my boyfriend, and I finished reading volume 2 a while ago, and he still hadn't finished reading it yet, so I couldn't move on to volume 3 until this week I began volume 3. So that is my excuse. That is my excuse why I haven't finished it yet, but I'm more than halfway done with it at this point, and I'm honestly really loving it, so I'm excited to give my full review of it when I do finish, which hopefully I will finish before the summer with that one. So we'll see. There's 4 total volumes, and I'm on the 3rd volume. So without further ado, I will tell you all the books that I have finished this winter, which I started out this year with a very interesting reading choice. I love reality TV, something I haven't talked about on this channel before because it's a book channel, but it does relate to the first book I read, which is called Cake Eater, and it's by Carl Radke, who is a person, I was going to say an actor, but he's not an actor because it's reality TV. A personality on one of my favorite reality shows, which is Summer House. And my friends and I read this memoir together because the new season was coming out soon, and I was like, we should all read this because maybe it will be good, but likely it will just be entertaining and funny. Unfortunately, it was neither of those things. It's honestly one of the worst books that I've ever read. Sorry, Carl. But I would not recommend it even for fans of the show because it offered basically no insights into the show. It's about his journey becoming sober, and that's very inspiring, and he's a very interesting person, but the book was just horribly written and didn't seem edited at all. So I know probably most of you wouldn't read this book anyway, but if you watch the show, I still wouldn't recommend this book. So unfortunately, I started the year out with reading a book that I did not enjoy. But the next book that I read was Beartown by Fredrik Backman, and this book is about a small town where hockey is really popular, and there's a junior hockey team, and an incident happens in the town that creates a division between the team and the star player, and then one of the girls in the town and her family. And so it was told from a bunch of different perspectives of people that live in the town. I thought it was really interesting. It is a series, and maybe I will read the other 2 books eventually, but I do feel like the first book was a pretty complete story, so I don't feel like I need to read the rest of the books. But I did enjoy that one. And the next book that I actually read for my class, and I had actually read it before, and that is The Sound of a Wild Snail Eating by Elizabeth Tova Bailey. And I read this for my nature writing class that I'm taking right now. I'm in a science writing program at Johns Hopkins, and we read this memoir for that class. And as you can see, I took a lot of notes as I was reading it. And this book, if you enjoy nature writing, is a wonderful, quick read. I enjoyed it even more through the second read through because I was really paying attention to the writing techniques that she uses for my class so I could analyze the book. And it's about this woman who comes down with this unexpected illness, and it basically leaves her bedridden for years, which is obviously awful, but it's about how her friend brings this snail in from outside for her to watch, and basically she has this snail in this little aquarium by her bedside, and it's one of the only things that she can do that she has the energy to do is observe this snail. And it's just a very poignant memoir, talking about the human connection with nature and how she still has that even though she is stuck in her bed. And then it's also a lot of natural history about snails, which is really interesting, in the way she weaves the two together. Her experience and the scientific information was just really interesting. So I would recommend that book. The next one that I read was also a memoir, and you will notice that I read a lot of nonfiction this winter. So apologies if you are not a nonfiction fan, because I am going to be talking about a lot of nonfiction. But that is Mother Mary Comes to Me by Arundhati Roy. And Arundhati Roy is a novelist, and she's also an activist, and she's from India. This memoir was basically about her journey to becoming a writer, but also her relationship with her mother, who ran a school, and she took care of a lot of different children at her school who, didn't have a lot of money and things like that, and she was seen as this very benevolent figure in the community. But her relationship with her kids was very rocky and abusive at times. And so it's kind of about how she reckons with her mother as the person she knows and the person that kind of the world sees. And then also how that leads to her career path as a writer. And I really enjoyed the book. I haven't read anything else by her, but she's a Booker Prize winner, and I have one of her novels, The God of Small Things, and I am looking forward to reading it after reading her memoir. The next book that I read was Love in the Time of Cholera by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and this is a historical fiction novel about a young woman and a man that she falls in love with when she's young, and then the man that she actually ends up marrying, and how their lives are kind of intertwined throughout the years, and the man that she fell in love with when she was young is kind of holding out for her throughout his whole life until her husband dies. And her husband dies in the first part of the book, and so it kind of goes back in time to how they all met and how these relationships formed. And while I really, really enjoyed the writing in this book, I will say that I feel like it glorified some things that it just took away from the writing and the story. The main character, the man that she meets when she's younger, he is a huge womanizer, which is fine, but he takes advantage of some women at points, and there's also some really racist comments in the writing, and the book was written in the 80s, so I can't really say that it was, you can kind of say it's a product of the time, but at that point I would hope for better. And so those were things that I felt like I really couldn't get past in the book, unfortunately. And even though I enjoyed the story and loved the writing, I wouldn't necessarily say that I would recommend reading the book because of those factors. And there's plenty of other amazing writing out there that you can read that doesn't include those things. So that's what I would say about that book. The next book that I finished was Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. Obviously, a lot of people have been reading this book this winter because the movie just came out. I did not watch the movie, and I probably won't because I've heard mixed reviews, and I didn't necessarily love the book enough to like want to watch the movie. But for those of you who don't know the story, it's about this young boy named Heathcliff who comes to live with this family, and the youngest daughter of the family is named Catherine, and they sort of have a love story, but it's not a healthy love story, and so it goes into their kind of relationship and family dynamics. Heathcliff was basically adopted into the family, and one of the big dynamics in the book, which is not portrayed in the movie, is that Heathcliff is not white. They don't specify his ethnicity, but he's not white and the family is white. And this book was written in the 1800s, so obviously that was a big dynamic, and a big reason why a lot of the characters in the book don't like him. And so it follows their story and their kind of like forbidden but also very toxic relationship, and then also the next generation in the family. And I enjoyed the story, definitely, but the writing was a little tough at points. There's one character who speaks in like a dialect, and it was really hard to read those sections just because of the way that it's written and to understand what was going on. But if you're curious about the book, I would definitely read it. And yeah, that's really all I have to say about it. The next book that I read is Winter World by, I don't know if you can see the cover because it's so bright, but it's by Bernd Heinrich. And he is a biology professor, and he actually worked at UVM, which is where I went to school. So I thought that was really cool. And basically this book is about how different animals adapt to the winter, especially in the Northeast, which is where he goes out into the woods in his property in Maine and also in Vermont, and he basically observes different animals and plants and how they adapt. And so I thought it was really interesting. I learned a lot from the book. I feel like it's kind of like a niche topic that, you know, if it's not something that already intrigues you, I don't think that the writing was super compelling to like get somebody to read it if it's not something that they're already interested in. But if it sounds like something you'd like to learn more about, I would definitely recommend the book. The next one that I read was The Price of Salt by Patricia Highsmith. And this book I came across actually because one of her short stories is about a snail, and that was mentioned in the snail book, The Sound of Wild Snail Eating, that I talked about earlier. And so I looked up the story and I read it, and I was like, I love this writing. And so I looked her up, and then I saw that one of her books was actually on my want to read list, and it was this novel. And so I was like, I'm gonna read this now. And the novel is a story. It's a love story about two women. One of them works in a department store, and one of them is a customer that comes into the store, and they start a relationship. And the woman who is married, she's kind of a wealthier woman, and she has a daughter and everything, and her marriage is kind of on the rocks. And then the department store worker, she's younger and she's kind of trying to figure out her career and her life and if she wants to get married. And this novel is kind of advertised as the first lesbian novel that has a happy ending. And it does have like a pretty hopeful, happy ending to it. I won't give any more away than that. But that was really cool to read as like a sort of historical thing. I can look up when it was written. Actually, 1952 is when the book was published. So very progressive for its time. And Patricia Highsmith actually used a pseudonym when the book was first published because she was a mystery novel writer and didn't want this book to be tied to her name at the time. And I would highly recommend this book. Her writing is incredible. It was really like a character study about these two women. And there were definitely some like high stakes points in the book that you can really tell that she is a mystery novel writer too. And so I would definitely recommend it. It's one of my favorite books that I've read so far this year. The next one that I read is Black is the Body, Stories from My Grandmother's Time, My Mother's Time, and Mine by Emily Bernard. And I read this book because she also lives in Vermont. The author is a professor, an English professor at UVM. And this book is just an essay collection about her experiences as a Black woman. And she was actually stabbed in like a mass shooting incident, a mass stabbing incident that happened at a coffee shop. And so that's like the first essay in the book. And it's supposed to be about like her experience moving through the world in her body. And while I found some of the essays really interesting, one of the other things in the book that I thought that I wish that she had explored more is they adopted two kids from Ethiopia, I believe. And she did talk about their adoption process, but I was kind of hoping that she would talk more about like the morality of adopting children from outside of the US and like what she thinks about that. And you know, maybe that just wasn't the purpose of the book, but that was definitely a topic I wish she'd explored further. So some of the essays I found really interesting and insightful, and others not so valuable. And she didn't really talk very much about her family history, like her mother and her grandmother, like the title would suggest. She does touch on it, but not as deeply as I would have thought. So I guess maybe the book just wasn't what I expected it to be. And yeah, not saying I wouldn't recommend it, but yeah, it was okay. The next book that I read was Devout, Losing My Faith to Find Myself by David Archuleta. And this is a memoir. David Archuleta, as many of you probably know, was an American Idol contestant. He was the runner-up, but he became a very famous pop star, and then he also went into becoming a religious music artist because he was raised in the LDS church, or the Mormon church. And he basically talks about his childhood upbringing, his family dynamics. There were some very traumatic instances that happened in his childhood that changed his family dynamics. And growing up, his journey to becoming a musician, and how that led to him eventually deconstructing his faith because he is queer, and the Mormon church does not really accept gay people at all. So he eventually ended up leaving the church, and he was kind of like a poster boy for the Mormon church, and how he left that role and what that was like, and what his life is like now as an out queer person and as a person who has left the church. So I thought that was really interesting. I love reading books about people's experiences with religion. And it was very well written and interesting to hear his perspective, as, you know, a famous person that a lot of people know, and, you know, you don't actually know these people, which is, you know, what this book really shows. So I would definitely recommend it if you like David Archuleta and want to learn more about him. The next book that I read is one of my new favorite books. I'm so excited to talk about it. And that is A Woman in the Polar Night by Christiane Ritter. This is one of the books that I had wanted to read this winter, and I'm so glad that I did. It's a memoir about her year living in the Arctic on this small island called Spitsbergen. And I think it's now called Svalbard, if you might have heard of that. And she's living in this tiny little hut with her husband and one other man who's a hunter. And the three of them are living there together. And it's about her experience being in such an isolated place. Sometimes she's alone for weeks while the two men go out and hunt. And her experience as a woman, because women, or at least white women, weren't really doing this and documenting it. And so people were saying, like, you're gonna go crazy, you know, you're gonna be cursed if you go and do this. And she was fine. But she made it out and she was fine. And she ended up falling in love with the area. I'm not sure if she ever did go back there. But the writing is beautiful. I would recommend this to anyone, honestly, even if you're not necessarily into reading books about the Arctic or anything like that, which I do really enjoy reading. I think it had a lot of very interesting things to say about humans and nature and just our kind of place in the world. And so I think that, yeah, it just became an all-time favorite book. And I hope to reread it someday because I think I could get even more out of it the second time. So I would highly recommend that. The next book that I read was A Marriage at Sea, A True Story of Love, Obsession, and Shipwreck by Sophie Elmhurst. And this is a book written by a journalist about a couple who in the 70s took this sailboat out and they were going to sail from the UK to New Zealand. And spoiler alert, which not really because it kind of says it on the front, is their boat gets hit by a whale and it sinks. And the couple is stuck on this raft for, I think it's 4 months. And it's basically about how they built the boat, how they went on their trip, and how they survive, and then the aftermath of their lives after the shipwreck. And even though it's in the 70s, they didn't have a radio on the ship. They didn't want to bring one because they wanted to just like be in the remote ocean. And obviously it led them to have to wait 4 months to be rescued. So it was very exciting, especially that part when they were stranded. But I will say, like, the end of the book, even though it was very touching, without saying too much, I just thought that maybe it didn't really need to be included. So yeah, that was my thoughts. If you're interested in an exciting story about a shipwreck, then definitely give this a shot. All right, I have 3 more books to discuss. The next one is NP by Banana Yoshimoto. And I actually got this at, I think it's called Green Mountain Books and Prints. It's this used bookstore in, I believe, Lyndonville, Vermont. And I got a few other books there, and it had a really cool selection. So if you're in that area, I would highly recommend taking a stop in and grabbing some books from them. But I have read one other novel by Banana Yoshimoto called Kitchen. It's more of a novella and has a short story in it as well. And that's her most popular book by far. And I loved that book. And so I wanted to read more from her. So when I saw this one, I was very excited and I picked it up. It's basically about this woman who has this boyfriend who's translating a story by this famous writer who died, and he's trying to translate it from English to Japanese. But he dies, and it seems like everyone who is trying to translate the story or who is involved with this story has some bad fortunes come their way. So she eventually gets close to the writer's children, and it's basically about her relationship with them and their relationship with each other, and like father son / daughter dynamics, sibling dynamics. But this book it's very strange. I will leave it at that. I wouldn't necessarily say, if you haven't read anything by this author before, I would definitely read Kitchen. It's very popular for a reason. This one I think would definitely turn people off from reading more by her, because it deals with some very sensitive topics that I don't think every reader would want to read about. I mean, I honestly didn't even really want to read about it, but I like her writing style, so I did push through the book and finish it. But I wouldn't necessarily recommend it or say that I enjoyed it a lot. But I am definitely looking forward to reading her other books. I have a couple others by her, and by no means will I never read something from her again. But yeah, that was my opinion about that one. And then the next one that I read was another new all-time favorite book. So I had two that I read this winter, which I'm very happy about. And that is Brave the Wild River, The Untold Story of Two Women Who Mapped the Botany of the Grand Canyon by Melissa L. Savigny. And this is another book written by a journalist, and she tells the story of these two women who are botanists who go out to run the Grand Canyon and collect samples of all the plants along the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon, because it's never been done before. And this was happening in the 1920s, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. And so it was very dangerous to do this at the time. A lot of people had died trying to run the Grand Canyon. And the only other woman who had tried to do it, her and her husband were lost in the river, and they never recovered their bodies. And so it was a very dangerous endeavor. And they had a lot of trouble getting backing from the university. They worked at the University of Michigan. One was a PhD student, and one was a lecturer professor at the university. And so they end up kind of getting this ragtag team of people to go down the river with them. They have a river guide, and then 3 other men start the journey with them. And the book was it was so exciting to read about their journey down the river. And there were definitely some mishaps along the way, which were exciting to read about. And then also Savigny does a great job of describing the landscape and describing the different plants and that they see along the way, because it is also, kind of a natural history of the Grand Canyon. She goes into the history of how the Colorado River and the rivers in that area, how they were dammed, and what that did to the ecosystem there. She talks about the indigenous people that live there and what they use the different plants for. She talks about just the history of settlers coming into the area. She covers so much, the history of the National Park Service, and how the Grand Canyon National Park came to be. So she puts a lot of information, and the amount of research that she must have done for this book, I cannot even fathom how long that took and how much effort it would have taken to put that into a story that is interesting and compelling to read. And so I was just really impressed by how well researched it was, while also being a great story and the storytelling being so exciting. So I would highly recommend that book. And I think that, yeah, it's just like a great example of amazing research and writing. The last book that I read this winter, thanks for sticking with me if you're still watching this book, was 33 Place Brugmann by Alice Austen. And this is a historical fiction novel about World War II in Brussels. And it's about the different tenants that live in this apartment building and kind of how all their lives are intertwined and how things change as the Nazi regime comes into Brussels and takes over. And it's a story of their families, some romance going on, and just their friendships. And, you know, some people in the building are kind of tattling on other people in the building, and some people are trying to protect and help with the underground railroad of sorts of Jewish people who are trying to escape the country and get away from the Nazis. So it was really interesting. It was also told from many different perspectives of the different tenants in the building. And it was a really interesting story. And it's a perspective from World War II era that I don't think has really been covered very much. So I thought that that was cool to read about. And yeah, I would recommend it. So that's everything. That's everything that I read this winter. Like I said, I'm still reading War and Peace. I don't know what else I'm gonna read next. We'll see. I haven't really made a list of things I want to read this spring. So the world is my oyster, I guess. I hope to read more novels because I read a lot of nonfiction, which was great, but I think I'm kind of getting burnt out from that. So I think I'll probably be reading more novels this spring. And yeah, please let me know if you have a favorite book, a new all-time favorite book that you've read recently, or if you've read any of the books I mentioned, what you think of them. I'd love to hear. And thanks for watching. I will see you next time.